to the second installment of Here's Elsewhere, Literature in Translation. This session is sponsored by the Literary Translators Association of Canada. And today we're really happy to present Ray Ellenwood, who will speak, who will be in conversation, but mostly he will honor us with his very deep knowledge of the Montreal Automatist movement. So just a little bit of housekeeping. What we'll do is we'll have a session that will last till about 7:50, and then we will take questions. And if we go over time, those who want to stay can certainly stay. Okay, if that's okay with everybody. I'm going to, of course, introduce Ray, there he is, who is really one of the great treasures of Canada. This is something that many of us agree on. Yeah.
If we are not in front of the computer, people won't see us.
I don't care. I don't want them to see me.
Okay, so
that's why I have to.
So somebody should, yes. Anyway, so here I go. One of the principal historians of the Canadian avant-garde, Ray Ellenwood has authored many publications, including Egregore, the Montreal Automatist Movement. His book, which he will show you, has been published in translation in Quebec, a translation by Jean-Tonin Billard, the late Jean-Tonin Billard. So it's quite an extraordinary book. It's quite a wonderful edition because it has a lot of images that weren't available in the first edition. He counts among his numerous translations Marie-Claire Blais' first openly lesbian novel, Nights in the Underground, as well as several of Jacques Ferrand's many works, including Quince Jam and The Penniless Redeemer, and of course the works of the Automatist movement's principal exponents, including Paul-Émile Borduas, Claude Gauvreau, Gilles Hénaud, Thérèse Renaud, François Sullivan, and most of them also signatories of their manifesto Refus Global, or Total Refusal, which Ray translated. From the outset, Ray Ellenwood has been active and as well as an activist in the field of literary translation, drawing public attention to policies that have historically served to marginalize literary translation in Canada. He was a founding member of the Literary Translators Association, where he served as president, and was one of the architects of Canada's public lending right program. So without more ado, Ray, I'm going to ask you to give us a little bit of a walk along your life. In other words, give us a sense of your trajectory. How did you get to be immersed and expose and introduce everybody to the values of the Automatist movement? How did you get to there?
Well, of course, I started out studying 18th century English literature, Steele and Addison. You see the connection, right? At a given moment, having done my studies in English, I decided that I wanted to branch out and to look at other disciplines and to look at other languages and to study comparative literature, which I did. I went to Rutgers and did a lot of took courses on visual arts and in courses in French literature, and became more and more interested in the French Surrealist movement, so that I eventually ended up writing my dissertation on Henri Breton and his interest in the theories of Sigmund Freud. And as I was working on that thesis, finishing it, I was also looking for a job. And we all came up to my brother's place in Montreal. And this was in '71. I started looking for a job, and I knew about the comparative literature program at Sherbrooke. And I got in touch with Doug Jones, whom I hadn't met before, and trying to get a job. And as it turns out, he was living with a young woman who's here right now, as a matter of fact. Sheila was living with Doug at that time, if I remember correctly. In fact, we held up supper we were late for supper. but in any case, while talking about my academic aspirations and my interest in surrealism, Doug Jones, who many of you will know about as a very fine poet, translator, critic, and professor, just said to me in passing at the end of the conversation, well, do you know about that gang who were called the Montreal Automatistes? People like Claude Gauvreau and Paul-Marie Lapointe and Borduas, so on. Well, I was utterly ignorant, and I told him so. But my curiosity was piqued. And when I finally did finish the thesis and get a job in Toronto, just as luck would have it, and in this whole story, there's an enormous amount of hasard objectif. Barry Callahan had just started a literary magazine in Toronto. He was one of my colleagues at York. And he came to me and he said, I've got a translation here of a poet called Claude Gauvreau, whom I hear is who's apparently an interesting poet, but this translation doesn't show it. So I told him I would look at the translation and check it against the original and see what I thought. So I recalled Doug mentioning Claude Gauvreau, and I was interested. And as I looked at the text, it seemed to me that the translation was absolutely inadequate. And so I did one for Barry, and that was my first major translation concerning the Automatistes. That was a play called Bienetre, which had a history in the movement, because even before they published their manifesto, they were having various kinds of manifestations, art exhibitions, and so on. But they also did productions of plays, and one of them being the play Bienetre. It was a bit of a disaster from the point of view of publicity, because most of the audience had left by the time the play began, because they found it so outrageous. But it became a kind of quintessential text in the history of automatism.
Okay, with what I'm going to interrupt you and get you right into talking about the Automatist movement, and describe a bit how this phenomenon came about, and perhaps, I mean, I'm sure you'll illustrate it with wonderful things. So I'm just gonna let you take it away.
Well, the movement began in a context of in a kind of repressive artistic and social context of Quebec at the time. And in the early 40s, artists and intellectuals and critics began to get their backs up concerning the very conservative art education at the time at the Beaux-Arts, the school, the École des Beaux-Arts. And Paul-Émile Borduas, along with people like John Lyman and Maurice Gagnon, the father of the famous, just recently died, François-Marc Gagnon, these people began to get together and to organize alternative exhibitions and to push for a different kind of expression, both artistic and social. As time went on, they organized a new society of artists called the can't remember the title. Somebody help me out. The Contemporary Art Society. Lyman was very, very important for the development of that society. They began to have shows, and Borduas, who was teaching at the École du Meuble, the kind of alternative to the École des Beaux-Arts, Borduas, who was teaching there, had some very interesting students, and he began to encourage the Contemporary Art Society to allow these young people to show. At the same time, Borduas was becoming very interested in Surrealist theory, Surrealist art, the whole notion of automatism, and he began to play around with some techniques of automatism, and produced in 1942 or 3, I've forgotten the exact date, a series of gouache that were made, according to his description, spontaneously, beginning with a spontaneous line, no sense of any kind of preconceived idea of what he was going to do, and then colored in after. And these gouache he called surrealist. Later he said they weren't surrealist, they were more cubist than surrealist, but nonetheless they were some important examples of non-preconceived art, automatic, spontaneous expression. And they had a huge impact on the young people who were hanging around Borduas. And those young people began to show with the Contemporary Art Society, and they got too big for their britches, and they started complaining that the other artists, like Lyman in the Canadian Art Society, were too conservative also. And there were brouhahas happening, and they were the youngsters and Borduas began to have their own separate exhibitions and so on. And finally, things blew up with the publication of a manifesto in 1948 entitled Refus Global, which was a kind of burning of bridges with Quebec society, with the church, and with the art establishment of the time, calling for more courage, more spontaneity, and a break with an inhibiting past. I could read you some.
Maybe read us some of the text, perhaps from
Sure.
Global or.
Sure. This text, by the way, caused quite a strong reaction in the press and in the government. Borduas lost his job, so it had a very strong negative impact. He talks about the small and humble people of Quebec who have been really quite subservient. And then he says, gradually things have begun to change and they're starting to get a little spirit. And the war helped to change things. And he says, the bounds of our dreams were changed forever. The thick, tattered curtains of our horizon suddenly fell and we were left dizzy. Shame at our hopeless bondage gave way to pride in a liberty that could be won with vigorous struggle. To hell with holy water and the French-Canadian tuque. To hell with the church and to hell with Quebec folklore. Whatever they once gave, they are now taking back again 1,000-fold. We reached beyond Christianity to touch the burning brotherhood of humanity on which the church had become a closed door. It was statements like that that got Borduas in trouble with the political and moral establishment of Montreal. And then he went on to, there's a kind of a utopian, anyway, you'll see from the text. We reject all forms of intention, the two-edged, perilous sword of reason. Down with both of them. Back they go. Make way for magic. Make way for objective mysteries. Make way for love. Make way for necessities. So there was this kind of exuberant call for a totally different view of life and love and art. Now, maybe I should show you a little.
Yes, show us a little bit, because what is so interesting about this movement is that it incorporated all the arts, the performing arts, the visual arts, the literary arts. And in that sense, it was very, very open and broad in its expression, right?
Yes, I should explain that I was reading from the introductory text, the essay, the manifesto itself, Refus global, which gave the whole book its title. But there were texts by sample plays by Claude Gauvreau. There was a text by Bruno Cormier. There were two other texts by Borduas. There were three plays by Claude Gauvreau. And there was a text on dance by Françoise Sullivan. So, as you say, it was a multidisciplinary event. It was supposed to go along with an exhibition, with an art exhibition. That exhibition never happened. But the manifesto, which came out, was hammered in the press, kind of dropped out of sight, and then gradually, over the years, was becoming more and more recognized and is now seen as a major document in Quebec's history. Now, to give you this, I'm going to show you just a page from a lovely little book by Thérèse Renaud, a book of poems called Les Sables du Rêve, which will give you an idea of the obvious surrealist quality. You can see these drawings are by Jean-Paul Mousseau, one of the group and one of the signatories of Refus global. And you can see how they retain the kind of biomorphic qualities that one associates with a lot of surrealist art. And Thérèse's poetry is the same. It's you might say automatic and non-rational, but it's still quite how can I put it, quite legible in the normal sense. Here are just a few lines from one of her poems, and another drawing by Mousseau to illustrate the drawing. And this, by the way, is from a lovely little facsimile edition done by Book Thug in Toronto. So here's my translation of what Thérèse, it was a part of a Thérèse poem. I laid down my head in an oyster shell. The grasses bent their ankles while I went out to meet three travelers. One of them had a glove on his hand. The glove was a sign of the sighing wind. They said, "Come with us. The road is long and hard, but at the end is a clearing where flowers laugh in the sun and a stream shines in the night." On the way, I broke my thumb, but a bear came to lick it, so I gathered some pebbles and threw them behind me. The second night, I brushed against fires that stars leave as they rush by, and I felt the burning caress of the moon. This is, if you're interested, if you know the history of French surrealism, you might recognize something like the poems of Gisèle Prassinos, who was discovered by the surrealists just before the Second World War. And Thérèse is very much in that tradition. Now, if you compare the Mousseau's drawings there to, well, for example, here is a Mousseau drawing that was done just about a year after this one. So recollect this one, and you can see the biomorphic qualities of that. Now here is where automatism begins to move away from surrealism and into non-figuration. This is a more completely abstract, non-figurative, beautiful drawing by Mousseau. I don't think you can see it very well there. So the automatist painters were moving in the direction of non-figuration, complete spontaneity. And I'm sure all of you know about the wonderful Rio panels that were done at this time, you know, with more and more overall covering the canvas with pure gesture. That's where they were going.
I'm very interested in in Francois Sullivan, not just as an extraordinary visual artist, but as a choreographer. And there are these very famous photographs of her choreography and her dancers in the snow. Maybe you can show some of those, because I find that that is very innovative in 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 the world, really, within surrealism, in fact. And her
Yeah.
choreographies, I mean, I've seen the performances of her, and they're really interesting, because
I thought I had some in this book.
I don't
Sorry,
know what,
Beatrice, go ahead.
but tell me, Ray, how did the Montreal artists in this group come about? How did they come about material and connections to the Europe, what the surrealists were doing internationally, especially in Europe?
Well,
Was there a connection among them, or?
they were French speaking. They got publications that came out of France, and then, of course, as you know, a lot of the surrealists ended up in New York during the war,
Right.
Breton included, and Maxence, Masson, and they published a magazine called VVV, Triple V, and the Automatist gang knew about that. They sent they got a subscription for the magazine, and Fernand Leduc, another one of the painters, wrote to Breton and was actually got for the group an invitation to join international surrealism. They declined politely and said, well, we're going in different directions.
I see.
And then, but connections were made. Then Riopel, first of all, Thérèse and Fernand Leduc went off. Thérèse went off first to Paris. Fernand followed her. They were married there. They were sitting in on the surrealist meetings, both of the Breton group and of the Cobra, what
Right.
would eventually become Cobra. So they had all these contacts and contacts, and Riopel especially was very active with the Breton group, and showed. He went off to France in '47, maybe before that. Just a minute, I'm getting, and spent some time. Signed a surrealist manifesto, Rupture inaugurale. Then came back to Quebec, signed the Refus global, and then went back to France with Isole, with his daughter, and became for years, for at least for a while, very active with the French surrealists.
Right. Right.
Now, both Riopel and Leduc had their differences, and eventually broke with the formal surrealist movement. I think both of them found Breton too arbitrary.
Right. And very interesting. They were very independent as a movement, And what happened to the Automatist movement after Refus Global? How much longer did they continue to work as an egregore, let's say, as a grouping?
Well, they're generally considered to have disbanded by 1955. They had a series of exhibitions. Borduas' life was essentially wrecked by the publishing of the manifesto. His marriage broke up. He lost his job, and he went off to the States for a while. And others began to leave Canada. The younger ones began to marry, have family life, and so on. So the collective activity, in effect, was taken over in large part by Claude Gauvreau and Jean-Paul Mousseau, and they had some exhibitions after that, up until about 1955. And
Well,
then,
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
That's a perfect segue to the next, to what we were going to touch upon, which is your translations of the work of Claude Gauvreau. I think it's hard for us to imagine what an what a breakthrough artist and poet he was, and what it meant for not just Quebec literature, but through your translations for Canadian literature. Maybe you can introduce us to his work and read from his work as well, and talk about the language he invented in a way, how he developed, how he experimented with language in both in various forms of writing, not just poetry, but drama and opera, right?
Well, let me read to you first just the opening lines of the play Bienetre, which was performed before the manifesto came out, and which was published in the manifesto. And if you read the opening lines, you could see why the public was a bit surprised by this. The description of the set is quite straightforward. It says, the interior of a house, at once slightly austere and slightly weird in proportions. To the left, almost in the center, a closed door that leads to another room of the house. A man and a woman enter, both wearing wedding clothes. The man wears black gloves. So here is the first speech by the man. And imagine yourself a Quebec bourgeois audience, used to kind of realistic, rather folksy drama. And two young people come out. Sorry, I'm not. In costumes like this, with a set made of newspaper. These photographs were taken later in somebody's apartment, but that's not the actual set. That's Claude and the well-known actress Muriel Guilbeault, who were playing. So imagine these people standing there, and the first speech goes, hands in the abyss, making leaves, that's a wedding. The cup running over with love like seaweed on the porch. A stream of clouds dives into the hearts. Kingfisher. Wreaths in cheeks, peace sculpted in the worried profiles of existence. Sugar woman. Hebraic joy in the procession of symbolic orange. Spread wings in the conjugated marbles. I see the furrows, I notice the wound of the roots, the poet who came into our souls by the keyhole. Well, people didn't take it. They walked out. By the time there was about a dozen people left by the end of the performance. But
it was a scandal, in other words, right?
It's a bit of a scandal, yes. And for Gauvreau, of course, it was a triumph. And if you look at the other set of poems called Entrails that he did, this is one of the more conservative ones. Maybe I can find a. Oh, never mind. Just believe me that Gauvreau pushed language to extremes. If you want to read about him, about his theories, there's a lovely little book published in Calgary of excerpts from Gauvreau's letters, where he talks about his poetic theory, and he says, you know, there's 4 different kinds of image, and he says the transformational image, the third kind, transcends metaphor. The elements are no longer assembled according to implicit comparisons. Rather, fusions are produced comparable to chemical combinations, as when sodium chloride is no longer either chlorine or sodium. In the transformational image, the transfigured elements can still be traced back relatively easily to their constituent elements. An uncomplicated example of a transformational element might be the fish chair. Everybody knows, at least by their functions, what a chair and a fish are. In nature, a fish has neither the form nor function of a chair any more than a chair has the form and function of a fish. Now, I think you'll see that if you look at the poems of Thérèse Renaud that I quoted earlier, it's this transformational image that she is working with. And Gauvreau argues that that's what essentially what the Surrealists wrote. But what he wanted to do was push things beyond that into what he called his explorational image, where the elements of the metaphor can no longer be discerned. I'll just see if I can find my I pirouette like the star of French women's pinions. Barakut ni I oppose the maguey with its lunar tungar nananada fabulut kirak 12 doggy with the cool cube adoob marma mira microscope. I am a tailor hoarding the measurements of handsome Dallo. This is the kind of stuff that Gauvreau became famous for or infamous for as time went on.
Tell me, Ray, how do you possibly translate that? I mean, you have to almost invent a parallel, a new kind of equivalent in English, no? Because you don't, I mean, in French, it sounds different, right?
Well, I cheat as much as I can, and I take the easy way out as much as I can.
Wow.
Sometimes I just put him straight in my own text. You see, if a passage that he gives of so-called nonsense, which he insists is not nonsense at all, he insists that one of his poems is as much a legitimate concrete object as a painting by Riopelle.
Right, and he calls these things objects, right?
They're objects, and they can be understood concretely. You know, if you just clear your mind of shit, you can understand these poems and these paintings absolutely clearly. That was Gauvreau's assertion.
And then
and so if there's a phonetic stream in one of his poems that looks like it will go in English, then sometimes I just take it tel quel. If I think there is a wordplay going on, or if I think that there are elements in the image that have lexical meaning, then I maybe try to look for equivalents. Sometimes the language is forward, and I translate it just as I would any other thing. So it's a question of just coming at each image independently, if you like. And to a certain extent, there is a certain liberty, and it might even be easier in a way to be able to take off from what Claude writes, than it would be to, for example, I've translated also Gilles Hénaud, who is a more standard poet. And with Hénaud, of course, I have to take into my whole setting a context, a more traditional context,
right.
A stream of thought or something. But with Claude, it's just words. It's just words coming at you. So one has a certain freedom to simply respond to those and to do one's best to give some sort of equivalent. It's never adequate, but then, as we all know, no translation is.
Well, your translations are pretty exceptional, really. I mean,
well,
especially, I mean, if you can talk to us, some of us have had the good luck of attending a play, for example, in your translation of a play. But maybe for some of the people in the audience, you could talk a little bit about the scope of Gauvreau's work, because he wrote plays, operas, and in your current work in it too, because I think you're working on such a production, right?
Yes, he wrote he wrote a set of what he called dramatic objects called entrailles, starting at about 45 up to 47. And they were very, very experimental objects. There was a title, there was the name of a character, but then after that, you know, anything could happen. One of the entrailles is just like a paragraph long, and it's purely phonetic. I wonder if I can find it. I should have prepared myself a little more quickly. No,
It's okay. It's okay.
I'll waste too much time, but it's pure phonetics.
And
With with one,
how would an actor do that? Like, they have to memorize the phonetics?
well, the actors who did the charge of the exploitable moose uh, memorized those lines.
Wow.
Don't ask me how they did it.
And yeah, because
it was really
also
quite astonishing.
his stage directions are very, very strange too, right? They give a lot of license to the director of the play, right?
Yes, yes. Gauvreau's plays really do allow dramaturges of all sorts to kind of imagine astonishing things. And the productions of the plays in Montreal have been really remarkable. And so was the one that Adam Selig did in Toronto.
Right.
Um, you
Now,
know, you can see here is a photograph of one of the earliest productions of La Charge de l'Orignal Éperméable. And you can see the costumes are really quite fantastic. And in all of the productions of Claude Gauvreau's plays that I've seen, including the opera that I'm now translating, the sets and costumes were as astonishing as the language. He stimulates people to produce remarkable work.
thank you, Ray. We're going to move over to the other poet you began to speak about, Gileno.
Yes.
What was his positioning within the Automatist movement?
Well, Eno was a self-taught intellectual poet uh, who just got to know the group as he became more interested in art. He interview with Borduas, and he got to know the people. Especially, he knew Marcel Ferron, the painter, the sister of Jacques Ferron. They were quite good friends, and he knew the gang. And in fact, there was even a talk at one time of doing an actual Automatist magazine, a literary review, along with Fernand Leduc and Borduas. They had discussions about that. The problem was that Gileno was a communist, formerly a communist, who wrote for the communist newspaper at the time. And he heroically tried for about a year to get the Automatistes and the communists talking to each other. And just as happened in France, it didn't work. So Borduas, for example, in Refus Global says that the left tried to get us to join them, but we found them too conservative. And anyway, Hainaut wrote in the Surrealist tradition and was very interested in French Surrealism. He was a social activist, a political organizer, a writer. He went off after the publication of Refus Global. He went off to Sudbury and was an activist in the union movement in Sudbury, and he published a union newspaper and so on. He became, he was constantly a social activist. But he eventually came back to Montreal, got back into journalism again, and became director of the Contemporary Art Museum for a few years. And not surprisingly and wonderfully, he put on some major exhibitions of the Automatist painters, among the first ones, the first big museums to put them on. And so he writes in the Surrealist tradition. He doesn't go in the same direction as Gauvreau did, and he would never pretend to do that. He wasn't terribly interested in Gauvreau's experimentations in pure language. So I had a lot of fun working on Gilles Leno, working on his poetry. Let me read you one of the poems, just as a change. I think I would like to, at some point, read a bit of my translation of Le Vampire à la Nymphomane, which is Claude Gauvreau's opera libretto.
Okay, let's yeah.
This is Gilles Leno, a song of cigarette butts. She's gone, leaving her butts behind. Hey, why not? Fire tells no tales, and the art of elegant smoking graces the world. How say you, hobgoblins of our magic days? Such times are fled as the soul cries out for a bloom of dangerous journeys. She's gone, leaving her butts behind. The flight of a sleek sail is transparent across remembered horizons, where an oar wrecks the waves of dream forever. She left without her cherry heart goldfish, without the rays of rainless days, without the mantle of noise woven by passing trains, without the little red riding hood of fleeting suns, without the teddy bear sitting in a downpour's desolation. She's gone, front side back, her youth unraveled, leaving poison like a fruit. No knife cuts like a burst of laughter. The contorted face is a bright, bright screen. On the first day, she made a spring flow from her hair. Never forget it. The second was a day of cloudless love on summer's isles, and the others were caravan days. The Orient paled beside this two-headed beast. And on the last day she went, leaving her butt, leaving her fan of puzzling pranks, a lock of her hair on the latch, her fingerprints on the ceiling, her exploded fits of rage through which the winds of future years now blow.
Fantastic poem. What a wonderful poem.
Yeah, I like that. Gilles Leno is worth looking at. You should all look at Gilles Leno.
Does he have a large body of work as a poet?
Yes, he does.
Yes.
And critical work as well.
Mm-hmm.
He's quite a prolific. In fact, there is a website on Gilles Leno, and you can go and hear readings of his stuff. And shots, films of him speaking and so on. He's a very quiet and modest man, it seems to me.
So Ray, you were going to talk to us a little bit about that opera that you're translating of Claude Gauvreau. Maybe read to us a little bit from it, or
okay.
And then we'll open it up for questions, because there are a couple of really interesting questions, at least two. Yes. So
just after the publication of Refus Global and the reaction to it in 1949, Claude Gauvreau had an agreement with a composer named Pierre Mercure, who is recognized as one of the great composers of contemporary music in Quebec, and who became very important later on in television and in the production of music and dance on television. But Mercure at the time was a student with had gone off to France to study with a grant of some sort, and he had asked Claude to write a libretto for an opera, uh, which Claude did. But a journalist came to interview Claude and saw the text and then published an article ridiculing it.
Oh,
And Mercure got wind of this and withdrew his, decided he wouldn't write the music for the libretto. And this became a public kerfuffle. There was an exchange of letters in the newspapers, and the letters between Claude Gauvreau and Jean-Claude Dussault, from which those theoretical comments on poetry that I read from, are from a set of letters that exchanged between Claude Gauvreau and a student at the time who wanted to learn about automatism. And Dussault asks Gauvreau about the fight between him and Mercure, and then that leads to general comments on automatism. But between 1949 and 1996, nothing happened with that libretto. But then the wonderful company in Montreal called Chant Libre did the opera. Absolutely stunning production of this opera. And I've had the great privilege of talking to various people who were involved in the production. Fides Krucker, just amazing to see it. By the way, you can look up this play. You can see this play, a video of the original production. You can find that on the web.
and it's called?
Le Vampire et la Nymphomane.
Okay.
And you can go to Chant Libre, Chants Libre, and it might be on their site. So it is available, and it's really quite stunning. I was provoked, if you like, by that production when I saw it, and I decided that I had to make a try at translating it. So that was in 1996. I don't work very quickly because I've just got a draft of the translation. It's the opera has to do with what operas always have to do with love and conflict and lovers against society. And so, to really oversimplify things, the vampire falls in love with a character whose name is l'adorable Verrotière, who then later is the nymphomaniac of the title. And their love causes all the weight of family, society, and church to come down upon them. And she is carted off to an asylum, and he eventually breaks into the asylum and liberates her, but they die. Pure opera, right? But the thing about Gauvreau's opera is that it is incredibly verbal. It is just an explosion of the most outrageous language. And for me, the problems begin with the very first words. L'adorable Verrotière, which is the name of the major female character. Vertière, as I understood it, has to do with glass, with the manufacture of glass, essentially glass trinkets. That was my first understanding of the word. And so in my draft of the translation, I have called her the adorable glass beater.
Nice.
It's pretty awkward and pretty, I don't think it's nice at all. I don't like it at all. But then I also learned, with a little help from my friends, that there actually is a word in France, from the west coast of France. A vertière is a woman who picks worms, goes to the shore, goes to the sand along the shore, and finds worms which she sells to fishermen. Now, it turns out that toward the end of this play, there are references to the sea, to sand, to mud, and even to worms. So is it possible that Dame Claude Gauvreau is playing with worms and glass in the name? I don't know, but here's an example of how I chicken out. I think I'm going to write a note, because Claude wrote notes, right, to explain certain things. I'm going to write a note to explain this bloody name, and I'm just going to use the French.
Right.
Because I like it, the way it rolls in the French. So here's how the play opens. Oh, there's an opera, sorry, an opera. Well, how can I say play? It's an opera. This is sung, right? The adorable Vertière was sicculating on the porcelain miters. The adorable Vertière was sicculating on the white hedgerows of chocolate. And inside the pallid Solaramur, the pascaline powder sipped sweaty days of roughened alabaster. Prophetic dome where charity and black turds frolic, tide of sperm and dechassied neck size in the pool of ink, holstered pistol, Nabuda Caesar, the sheet of the cooled kino, the pinprick already cooled by the evil of cedar micros, where the aspirin fisher generates and curiates the becogged eupher. The stage is the crossroads of mitigated padding, of probing padding, of lubricated domes. The love-lorn pastoral reiterates the jacket and dozes necrophilically the tepid margins of the tide of snails and the warm greenhouse of sturgeons. Veil of moistened mica, suppuration of verdant and elastic rages, climate of raked chasuble, climate of frigorific dawn and transient smell. Hell, I can't even read it. How do you sing it?
Well, I mean, you've
But
impressed us.
they did it. They did it. It was, I mean, it just comes at you like a wall of sound, and you as the spectator are there trying to make sense of this. And I find that you're eventually just seduced and you just say, okay, I won't try to explain this to myself. I'll just let it come.
You just absorb it. Yes. You just
absorb
surrender. You
and
surrender.
you surrender to it. And so that's what I'm working on now by Claude Gauvreau.
Well, thank you so much, Ray. I mean, it's we have focused a lot on Claude Gauvreau, but he is a very important figure, and he is one of, you've translated a lot of his work, and he has a huge body of work, so it's fitting. I'm going
Just a minute. Can you see this? Just a minute. I'm going to break the rules here a little bit.
Yeah, and then what we're going to do is open it up for questions. Okay. Oh wow, you're going to take.
Can you see this, people?
We can see lots of. Oh yeah, that's it. We can. Yes.
Can you see that?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a drawing by Claude Gauvreau. An ink drawing by Claude.
Thank you very much, Ray. It's beautiful.
A lovely drawing. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ray. It's been, I'm sure everybody will agree, it's fantastic. So I'm going to let Alex, who has no face, just the logo of the association, I'm gonna, hi, Alex. I'm
Hello.
gonna ask you to read the questions for Ray to answer.
Yeah,
please.
so we just have a couple of questions so far, and remind everyone if you have a question that you want to ask, to write it out in the text box on the right, and we'll work our way through them. So the first question is from Nathan, who says, I would like to ask if there are disputes between the Montreal Automatistes and the geometric abstraction artists, like the dispute that in France led Charles Etienne to write L'art abstrait est-il un académisme? And second part of the question, how are the relationships between the Montreal Automatistes and alchemy and the esoteric tradition, as shown by the name Egregore?
Oh my.
Well, maybe, maybe the first one first.
Well, I don't know. First of all, there was yes, there were disputes between the Automatistes and people who were taking abstraction in different directions. There was the group that followed them, for example, who eventually called themselves the plasticiens, who moved more in the direction of a kind of geometric abstraction. And I don't think you can actually really call it a dispute. It's just people going. Now, there was a real dispute between the Automatistes and the figurative artists, especially of Quebec City, who dismissed abstraction altogether. But between the Automatistes and the plasticiens, I think you would just say there was more like an evolution. I don't know whether that treats with the first question or not. The Automatists' interest in the tradition of oh god, what's the word I'm looking for?
The occult or the
occult comes essentially from Pierre Mabille, who was a medical doctor associated with the Surrealists and who wrote a book called Egregore, or the Life of Civilizations. And he also wrote about alchemy. And it was essentially, I think, if there was much interest in those subjects among the Automatistes, I think it had to do with an interest in Mabille. But I don't pretend to be up on that subject at all.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Patrick Coleman, who asks if Govreau's novel Beauté Baroque has been translated.
It's been translated into Italian, but not into English. Not that I know of, anyway.
I mean, you would know.
Not necessarily. I'm out of the loop, you know.
Not true. Are there any other questions?
Minab Yadbarak asks if they could ask a question through audio.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Hi there. Sorry, I tried to type my question out, but I found it too long to type. So I thought it better to ask through audio. I hope nobody minds.
We're
happy.
Please,
go ahead.
Awesome. Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I feel very honored. And my question is, when you were describing the image of the sodium, I forget the chemical, but when two chemicals are coming together and they produce some new element or some new chemical reaction, and the description of the image that is formed because of the coming together of different words in that way. I found that very interesting as someone who has been very influenced by the work of the Institute of General Semantics, which tells me that words are not carriers of meaning themselves, but are sort of like triggers of associations of images or a collocation of images of sorts. And so I imagine that when you come to translate something that is sort of a series of, I believe it was said like phonetics, and a kind of a bunch of sounds, a series of sounds that are made. when it comes to translating that, I would imagine that a lot of the work has to come from the context surrounding the author's life and the author's work, and so on and so forth. How true do you think that is in this context, in this work that you have done? How much of the work depended on the history of the author and the history of the context surrounding the author's life?
That's an enormous question, but I think that
Apologies.
no, all translators are constrained to get as much information as they can to do their translations. Claude Gauvreau, in his poetic text, does not often afford what you might call a literary context. If you're translating a straight linear narrative, for example, you can make certain decisions on what you know about the logic of that narrative. But when Gauvreau is hitting you with a wall of syllables, without context, it's quite true, I think, that you have to say, well, what's he getting at here? And there is a temptation, and maybe it is a temptation. Maybe it's wrong on our part. And I have a feeling that he would have said it's wrong on my part to look for any kind of biographical or contextual source for those syllables. Does that make any sense to you? This is a problem for me. What you have raised, what you have done is expressed what I consider to be a problem. See, I'm left with this object and I have not much context. So I guess I find myself, just as you said, rather desperately looking to say, well, is Claude talking about Muriel Guilbeault, the love of his life, the woman that he obsessed over? Is he talking about her in this point, at this time? Should I be thinking that way or not? I think that's an open question.
Great.
Thank you. Rebecca asks, can you speak about the rivalry between Riopel and Borduas?
Between Riopel and Borduas? Well, best read Gilles Lapointe about that. Lapointe has written an article about it. And of course, François-Marc Gagnon, the late François-Marc Gagnon, in his last book, talked about that. His last book is on Riopel and the Automatistes. The problem was that when Riopel went off to Paris, which was one of Borduas' dreams, Riopel was very quickly successful. Such a sexy guy, you know, he couldn't miss. And people took to him very, very quickly. And he after a few difficult years, suddenly his career just took off. Started to show him, and major critics began to write about him. And Samuel Beckett began to translate texts about Riopel and so on. Of course, nobody knew Beckett at the time, so it didn't matter. But you know, he was a success very quickly in Paris, and Borduas wasn't. That was a point of contention between them. But I think that Riopel, in fact, it's out in the open. Riopel chafed under what might have been seen as a kind of authoritarianism of Borduas. Other people in the group didn't see that as authoritarianism. Pierre Gauvreau, who was a very good friend of Riopel, also, you know, it was Pierre Gauvreau and Riopel who, at the time of the publication of Refus Global, critiqued a text that Borduas had written where he said surrealism taught us this and that, and they said, well, excuse me, I'd have to go back to get the quotations correctly, but there was an argument within the group provoked by Riopel and Pierre Gauvreau critiquing what Borduas had said. So there were instances like that. And later on in his career, Riopel made it very clear that his life didn't end with automatism. You know, he carried on, and he made distinctions between himself and the Automatist group. And he said that, you know, his work took a totally different direction. And that attitude was not received well by some of the members of the group.
Great. Marshall asks, in Refus Global, Borduas compares his painting with the play of children. What are your thoughts on this comparison?
Borduas was very interested in children's art, and he wrote about it. And in the text that he wrote after Refus Global, in a kind of rebuttal against his critics, he talked about the importance for him of children's art. And he made a connection between the spontaneity of children and the spontaneity of the would-be spontaneity of the Automatist movement. They were trying for that kind of freedom from intention.
Phyllis asks, the Refus Global is often cited as a kind of precursor to the Quiet Revolution. I'm always amazed when I hear that. It seems to me that its spirit is antithetical to the kind of bureaucratic, technocratic impulse of the Quiet Revolution, or at least what it became. Can you comment on this?
Could you do the first part again just for a moment?
Yeah, the Refus Global is often cited as a kind of precursor to the Quiet Revolution. I'm always amazed when I hear that. It seems to me that its spirit is antithetical to the kind of bureaucratic, technocratic impulse of the Quiet Revolution, or at least what it became.
Well, that's a very interesting point, it seems to me, because it is true that Refus Global has been, if you like, taken on by people who see it as a precursor to the Quiet Revolution. And it is true that the Quiet Revolution politically, bureaucratically, is certainly something different. But can't we see just the slightest connection between a sense of self-worth that Refus Global is trying to promote, a sense of insistence that Quebec culture is worth promoting on its own, that it's not necessarily anymore to be, it's not necessary anymore to be, if you like, directed by a bureaucracy, a church, a social system that is repressive. So I think that connection that people want to make, it's a kind of spirit of social change that can be seen in Refus Global. But it's quite right that you don't want to necessarily confuse that with bureaucratic change. I'm not sure that that's a good answer to a good question.
Well, people seem to be very engaged with the questions, eh, Alex? There's another interesting question there.
Yeah, these are great stuff so far. We have another one from, how much longer would you like to go, Beatrice?
Well, let's see how many people are still left.
We still have 37 people, still a full house.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think we can go for another 5 minutes, no?
Okay, so we have a question from, and Phyllis has good answer. We have a question from Patrick who says, could you say something about the experience of translating Gauvreau and other Automatistes as compared with the experience of translating Jacques Ferron?
That's a hard question.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting question for kind of translation theory, I guess, because the different texts demand a different approach, it seems to me. Ferron's wordplay and Ferron's thought is sometimes very convoluted, his syntax as well. Betty, why don't you help out, for heaven's sake? Oh, you'd have to put your microphone on. To translate Ferron, you really have to work at the connections between words, the thought, the line as it goes. You have to wait until the very end before the beginning becomes clear. It's a kind of intellectual exercise with Ferron, syntactical exercise that is quite different from Gauvreau. Gauvreau presents you with, as I say, this wall of words. There is not the kind of game that Ferron requires. Can we hear you now, Betty? Could you add to that, maybe?
I can't add very much because I have not experienced the other. I can't make the comparison the way you can. But I think what you said about Ferron is quite lovely. There's so much you have to know and think about and understand, but you know what you have to know. You know you have to go into literary history. You know you have to go into the history of the language. But I can't imagine what it must feel like to translate somebody like Claude Gauvreau when you don't know what you have to dip into, what you have to find out. It's to me, it's unfathomable. So it must be totally different, and I don't know how you do the other.
Yeah, I don't know whether I do the other. I don't, you know, as I say, one does what one can.
Well, I think
It is a different mindset altogether.
like you couldn't be working on the two at the same time ever.
I've never tried.
In any case, I think that we are sort of at the end of the questions from what I can tell, right, Alex?
Yeah, it looks that way.
Yeah. And so we are coming to the end of the session. And I would like to thank Ray for a wonderful, wonderful event. I think we all I learned new things, certainly. And it was wonderful to share it with so many of you. And I thank you for being here with us today. So I'd like to wish you a transformative night. Perhaps you'll be encouraged to read the works of Gauvreau, go into some kind of internet bookstore and buy Ray's translations and look at the opera. I think we have I think Lida has put the website for the opera YouTube video. So there's much to follow up with. And thank you and good night to everybody.